Hello, everybody. Welcome to day 2, part 2 of Space Cat. During our last video, we were talking about exploring rhetoric and rhetorical analysis through space. Today, we're going to focus on the cat part. Okay. So, just like you know, space talks about the situation in which a text exists. The cat part really focuses on the techniques and the choices the writer is making in order to clearly communicate their argument and accomplish a purpose. So let's talk about choices for a moment. This category is all the little moves that a writer makes to enrich their writing. So we need to ask ourselves as we read, what do we notice about the writer's writing? And why does the writer do that? Why do they make that choice? So, an example of this is that a speechwriter may begin with a personal anecdote, something from their past, and then move on to describing a process of change and then end with a call to action. When we talk about choices, we're talking about the little things that they do within their sentence structure and their word choice, but we're also zooming out and looking at their organization as a whole. Do you notice that they compare and contrast? Do you notice that they describe? Do they define? All of these are choices that the writer makes. So you and I need to have an agreement that we know that writers make choices to accomplish a purpose. If you can play that game, then we can get into the nitty gritty and look at what the writer specifically does. So here's an example of a list of choices that writers could make. You actually already have this handout. I believe it's on orange paper and you got it a few weeks ago from me. If you can find that in your folder or notebook, that would be very helpful. I've also linked this down in the slides at the bottom of the screen. That way, if you have a printer at home, you could print this out or write it out in your notebook. But this list is going to be very helpful. So there are lots of things that we talk about when we talk about writers' choices. We talk about sentence length and punctuation. You're going to notice that some writers use staccato sentences, very short, 1 to 4 word sentences to punctuate an idea or to show the intensity of something. You're also going to notice that some writers rely heavily on specific punctuation moves. For example, Jamaica Kincaid really loves using semicolons. Why? Well, they really help with her pacing. And so when we look at sentence length being staccato, short, or long sentences, or specific types of punctuation, they usually have to do with the writer creating pacing, slow, fast, creating suspense, or really making it intense for the reader or the audience. Another choice that the writer might make might be repetition. Do they repeat specific letter sounds, specific words, specific phrases, or specific word endings to highlight key ideas? Dr. King loves using repetition within his writing. If you read his I Have a Dream speech, he focuses in the beginning on the phrase 100 years later. And the repetition of that key phrase really intensifies his message for his audience and hypes them up, and maybe even makes them a little angry. When we talk about diction, we're talking about specific word choice. Now, don't fall into the trap that the writer uses diction. Shocker, the writer uses words. We want to be very descriptive in how we use the word diction. So you might say the writer uses figurative language. The writer uses harsh diction. The writer uses something, okay, to describe the diction specifically. Another method or another choice that a writer can make is syntax. Do they put the words in a specific and intriguing order that might be unusual or unexpected? So everyone loves Baby Yoda, right? But Yoda is the quintessential example if we're speaking in an unusual order that really gets our attention. I already talked about anecdotes in the other slide, but anecdotes can be lots of different forms. You can have personal anecdotes, historical, literary anecdotes, religious, hypothetical, pop culture, right? All of these anecdotes are really short little stories or little blurbs or insights about a person or a historical event that help further our understanding of the situation. Anecdotes are usually only a sentence to maybe 4 sentences long. They're usually very short, but they really provide more deep understanding to the argument as a whole. Writers can also rely on data. The data can be from a credible source. It shows the severity of a situation. Sometimes data is in the form of a chart, but data can also be over time. And so we want to think about what data is being used, if it's being used, or if we're reading an argument, why isn't data being used? A different choice that a writer can make is allusion. And so maybe they allude to a specific historical event or historical person without actually naming them. Here's the tricky thing with allusion. If a speaker is alluding to something specifically, that means that they are assuming that the writer is going, or the audience is going to know that allusion. They're going to get that reference without having to explain it. And then the final technique that writers typically use is rhetorical question. And so rhetorical questions poses a question to stimulate thinking, and it often evokes guilt or shame or motivation. And so when we talk about all of these different choices that a writer can make, writers are making them all the time, and many of them are used throughout an entire speech or essay or letter. You use a lot of these in your own writing. And so they're not necessarily fancy, but they are very effective. And that's what we're going to focus on next. So the CAT stands for choices. And then the next element of Space Cat has to do with appeals. And when we talk about appeals, we're talking about 3 different categories of appeals. A writer's techniques can appeal to ethics and credibility. We don't typically believe people we don't trust. So they need to establish their credibility as someone who knows what they're speaking about and that we can trust them. Writers also try to appeal to our emotion because we usually are led by our heart and our feelings. And so if they can appeal to our emotions, usually that's a really easy way to get your audience to move forward with your argument and to accomplish your purpose. And then the last appeal is really appealing to logic or reasoning. Some of you guys are very linear thinkers. This leads to this, leads to this, and you don't usually like the people or believe the people who don't incorporate a lot of logic or reasoning into their argument. And it's very important to you. You're not alone. So a lot of writers will try to utilize data to not only build their credibility as being a trustworthy source, but also to create that logic in their argument so their audience follows through. So some examples for you to consider is that when you bring up your expertise on a topic, that usually builds your credibility. If you tell a moving story about your mom or your grandmother, that can create emotion. Or if you state those facts or statistics, that can also create logic. So if we take a look at the very same list I just showed you, you'll see that we have the list on the left-hand side, but then I have arrows pointing down, and that's because all of these different techniques and choices can create a trusting relationship between the audience and the speaker. It can make the audience care about the problem, the argument, or the message. And it can also make the audience believe in the rationale or believe in the argument or believe in the purpose. And so we want to make sure that we're not just saying, oh, they used repetition, or, oh, that's interesting syntax, but the why. What is it appealing to that really helps the writer accomplish their purpose? And then the last element of Space Cat really has to do with tone. The College Board is always going to ask you to analyze the tone of a specific piece, and they usually want it in like a word or two, typically two. So what is the speaker's attitude at the different places throughout the text? Do you notice a tone shift, right? So it starts as this, but it ends as this. How can you tell that this is their attitude? What words or sentences are really contributing to creating that tone? And then that shift in the piece, why does it shift there? Why do they go from this to this? So Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech begins incredibly critical, but ends very hopeful and motivating. And so this shift going from this, then this, or this, yet this, and this can really help us have a deeper understanding of the writer's experience and the specific audience they're trying to address. So the examples listed down below of religious eulogy may begin with a mournful tone, then move into a comforting or inspirational tone. So you just want to be very cognizant as you are reading, like, oh, that's a change. Oh, we just like something's different here, and try to note take as much as you can. All right, so that's CAT. So when do we use Space Cat? We know that rhetorical analysis requires us to read and understand what matters about a text, the space it exists in, and then comment on the specific features that make it rich or effective to really accomplish that purpose. And that's the CAT. So what is going to be very helpful for you is if you have these two acronyms written out, that way you can always go back and reference them as you're exploring different texts during this unit. All right. Thank you guys.